Here we're going to look at the price elasticity of demand. So the determinants of the price elasticity of demand, we'll look at a series of examples. And in each example, we're going to be considering what would happen if the price of both goods rise by 20%. So in our first example here, we're looking at breakfast cereal versus sunscreen. If the price of both of these goods goes up by 20%, for which good does quantity drop the most and why? Breakfast cereal has close substitutes, so buyers can easily switch if the price rises. Sunscreen has no close substitutes, so a pricing increase would not affect demand very much. So price elasticity is higher when close substitutes are available. Blue jeans versus clothing. If the price of both of these goods rises by 20%, for which good does quantity drop the most and why? If you're going to define a good very narrowly, like blue jeans, you can come up with different substitutes. If you're going to define a good as very broad, such as clothing, there are fewer substitutes for clothing. So the price elasticity is higher for a good that's defined in very narrow terms. Insulin versus yachts. The price of both of these goods rises by 20%. For which good does quantity drop the most? Well, insulin is a necessity. If you're a diabetic, you have to have it. So a rise in price is going to cause little or no decrease in demand at all. A yacht, however, is a luxury. If the price rises, some people will forego purchasing a yacht. So price elasticity is higher for luxuries than for necessities. Gasoline in the short run versus gasoline in the long run. If the price of gasoline goes up by 20%, does the quantity demanded drop more in the short term or in the long run? In the short term, there's not much people can do other than maybe take a bus or hitch a ride. In the long run, however, people can make adjustments and buy smaller cars or maybe even move closer to their work. So price elasticity is higher in the long run. Variety of demand curves. Demand is elastic. The price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. If demand is inelastic, the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. If demand has unit elasticity, the price elasticity of demand equals 1. So, is demand perfectly inelastic? If it is, it would equal 0 and the demand curve would be vertical. If the demand is perfectly elastic, the price elasticity of demand would be infinite and the demand curve is horizontal. So the flatter the demand curve, the greater the price elasticity of demand, or the greater the price sensitivity of demand. So here are those principles that were just stated. Here's the way the graphs would look. So if demand is perfectly inelastic, the demand curve is going to be horizontal, straight up and down. If demand is inelastic, the price elasticity will be calculated as a number less than 1. The demand curve is still going to be relatively steep, and consumers' price sensitivity will be low. If demand is unit elastic, elasticity would be calculated as 1. And if we have elastic demand, the demand curve is going to be relatively flat, and the elasticity would be calculated as a number greater than 1. If we have perfectly elastic demand, the demand curve is going to be horizontal, and consumers are going to be very sensitive to price changes. Here's a few elasticities from the real world. If we look at elasticity along the straight line of the demand curve, the slope of a linear demand curve is constant. So if you were to calculate the slope up here or down here, the slope is going to be the same. However, elasticity along that line is not the same. So the elasticity is going to be much higher if you consider this part of the demand curve where the price of the good is more expensive. Elasticity will be much lower down here if the price of the good is cheap compared to other goods. How about elasticity in total revenue? Revenue refers to sales. So what happens if you raise the price of your product from 200 to 250? Well, if you raise your price, you could have higher revenue as a result of the higher price. However, if you sell less units, that would contribute to lower revenue. So which of the two is going to have a bigger effect on revenue? That's going to depend on how sensitive consumers are to the demand for that good. So for a price increase, if demand is elastic, elasticity of greater than 1, the percentage change in quantity would be greater than the percentage change in price. So your total revenue would fall. For a price increase, if the demand is inelastic, so the elasticity is less than 1, the percentage change in quantity would be less than the percentage change in price. So your total revenue would actually increase. The fall in revenue from lower quantity would be less than the increase in revenue from a higher price. So if you're considering price elasticity in total revenue, this part of the graph refers to the lower revenue due to the lower quantity that's going to be sold because you've raised your price. This part of the graph refers to the increased revenue due to the higher price. So when demand is elastic, a price increase causes your revenue or your actual sales to fall. So the difference between $2,400 at a price of $200 and only $2,000 in revenue at a price of $250. If your demand would be inelastic, the opposite would happen. And even though you've increased your price, your total revenue is actually going to go up. So when demand is inelastic, a price increase causes your revenue to rise. Consider elasticity in revenue for pharmacies that raise the price of insulin by 10%. Does the total expenditure on insulin go up or down? As a result of a fare war, the price of a luxury cruise goes down 20%. Does luxury cruise companies' total revenue rise or fall?